In this video, we will be amending our current tasks API to allow for integration of the task images. We'll be changing a few things here. First, we'll update the task model to hold an array of possible images. The array will be empty if there's no images for the said task, so it's easy for the client to see if the images for the task or not. We'll then move on to update the get task routes, so this will include return all tasks, return single task, return complete or incomplete tasks, and then obviously return tasks page by page. These will need to be updated to include obviously the task images themselves. We'll then move on to update patch route. This will include returning the updated task model with the list of images. We also need to update the delete task functionality, as now that should first delete all images including the physical files on the server and then delete the actual task itself. So if we open up Atom, I'm currently in the task controller, but I need to be in the task model. So within here, we need to create a new, so if we create private, a new instance variable called images, this will store the task images as an array. We'll update the constructor, obviously taking into account the getters and setters. So what we'll do now is create the setter for the images. So if we scroll down and we'll come underneath set complete, public function set images, and we'll be passing in the images as an array. So first of all, we need to check to make sure that it is an array. So is array, and we'll check images, and if it's not an array, we need to throw new task exception, and the error message for that will be images is not an array. However, obviously if it is an array that you're passing in, then we need to set it so it's this images equals the passed in images. So that's the setters created. So now if we go back up to the constructor, we can alter this to now accept images as an argument. What we'll do is we'll call this images and it'll be a blank array. So if we don't pass in the images, so this could be an optional parameter. If we don't pass in images, it'll actually create it as a blank array. So from there we will create, so set images and pass in the images. So once that's created, we now need to create the getter. So underneath this, so public function get images, and we want to return this images. So now that we've done that, if we scroll down to the bottom where we return the task, we now need to create a new bit of data here called tasks called images. And then we need to use this get images. So we're using the getters and setters. So now that's done, we should be able to move on to the task controller. I'm just going to double check. So we're saving the image in images, we're passing in, we're setting it, scroll down, get images is returning the images, and under the setter, so set images we're passing in, it's an array. If it's not an array, we'll throw a new task exception, but if it is, then we save it and then we return it under the get images for the task. So that's the task model created. So now what we need to do, I'm actually in the task controller. So what we're going to do here, we need to import the image model itself. So just like we did with the response and the task. So require once, and then it's model and then image.php, so that includes the image model. And within the get, a lot of the gets on this page, so a lot of the return of the task, we actually want to perform the same function. So instead of copy and pasting in the same sort of SQL query and stuff, we're going to create a function for that. So we're going to call the function retrieve task images. This will take in 3 parameters. Now, obviously, depending on which route that we're on, depends on which database connection we're using. So we're going to create a generic sort of database connection here that we can pass the said connection into. So once we've done that, we pass in a task ID and then a returned user ID. What this function will do is, for the given task ID, it will go to the database and retrieve all images associated with that task ID, obviously if there is any. We'll store them in an array, and then we will return the array back, from the function to be passed into the task model that we've just adjusted before. So we'll pass the array in as an image, and then when we return the task, it will return the images if there is any. And if there isn't, then we'll return a blank array just to tell the client that there is no images to return. So what we'll do now is create the image query, and we will use the dbcon, so whichever database connection we'll pass in, prepare, and we're not going to wrap this in a try and catch because this throws an error, and we're actually calling this function within the try and catches within our task controller. So just to make this easier to see, I'm just going to fold all of this up like we did previously, fold all. And then if we come down to here, we've got the root logic here. So if we go into the given task, so task ID, and then if we go to the get, you can see the try and catches here. Now we're currently catching task exception and PDO exception, but we will need to add a further catch block in here to catch an image exception. But first of all, what we'll do is we'll implement this function, so image query, and then we'll pass in the SQL, so select tbl images.id, tbl images.title, tbl images.filename, tbl images.MIME-type, tbl images.taskID, from tbl images and tbl tasks, where tbl tasks.id is equal to a passed in task ID, and tbl tasks.user.id is equal to the passed in user ID, and tbl tasks.id is equal to tbl images.taskID. So what this SQL will do, return all of the image attributes for all of the images for the said task. So then what we should be able to do is bind the parameters, so image query bind param. First one was task ID, PDO param int, image query bind param user ID, returned user ID, PDO param integer, and then we want to execute. So image query execute. So once that's ran, obviously that can return 0, that's fine, but when it runs we need to store the results in an image array, so image array, and that will be a blank array at the minute. So even if this returns 0, this blank array will be returned back for the said task. So we need to do away, and then image row equals image query fetch PDO fetch associative array. So the first, oops, not away, that should be a while. So the first thing we need to do is to create the image, so new image from the model that's been returned from the database. So image row ID, image row title, image row file name, image row MIME type, image row, image row, and then it was task ID. So we've created the image here, we'll then need to add this image into the images array. So image array, and then it is equals, and then and that's image return image as array. Because remember, this is how we do the JSON encode to obviously convert it into JSON object. So whilst that's done that, creates the image, adds the image, and once we've done that, we need to return out of this function, return image array. Okay, so we'll get all of the tasks, all of the images for the said task. We'll then obviously create a blank image array. For each of the image, we'll return the image as an array, add it to that image array, and then return it. So that should be that function now done. So now if we scroll down, and if we go into our get single task for the get, and if we open up the try catch and open up the while, so basically just before you create the task, we need to call this function. So the function is, and we need to store obviously the returned array in an variable, so we'll just call this image array, and the function was retrieve task images. And what we do here is look to see what database connection has been used. So this one's readdb, so we'll pass that in. So readdb, and then the task ID. Remember, we're getting the task ID from up here. It's passed in the query string. So task ID, and then the returned user ID, which is part of our authentication, sort of this bit here. So once we've done that, we now need to pass this image array into the task constructor. Remember, we adjusted the task model to accept this new images variable. So we just need to pass that in the end there. So image array. And remember, this is important to add on your additional catch block for an image exception. So image exception EX. And for the minute, we're just going to copy and paste this same code because it's still relevant. Obviously, in the previous set of videos, we've created a function for this, but I didn't want to go through and sort of adjust our task controller to incorporate this new sort of send response function. So, you know, that's sort of getting away from the point of what I'm trying to teach in this video. We will just copy and paste the response in this way. So now that the get single task set up, what we should be able to do now is actually test it. So if we open Postman, I'll have to create a new session. So I'll create a new session here, copy the session access token, and the first thing we're going to do is return, so v1/tasks, and I've got a task ID of 1. So authorization access token in there. You can see that we've returned the task and that the images are now returned with the task. The images is blank, which is correct because we deleted them in the previous video. So if we quickly create some images against this, tasks/images in our header, authorization access token. Then in the body, remember it's form data, attributes and image file. Change the file to file, and in the attributes create your JSON body. So the first one was title, and I'm just going to call this image1 title, and the next one is file name, and we'll call this image1. So select the file, and I'll just pick the sky for the time being. So if we post this, you can see the image has been uploaded successfully against task 1. And then if we go back to the get single task, scroll down, you can see that now images has been returned sort of an array of images. Obviously we've got 1 there at the minute. So if we just quickly go and create a second image against that task, just choose a different one, water tree and send that. You can see that it's created 2 images. So if we go back to get single task, we now should have 2 images returned. So there you go. So there's image 1 and then there's image 2. So the get single task has now been updated to take into account images. So we'll just go through and do them for the other get methods. So if we go back to Atom, and what I'm going to do is just close this get request up here, because we also need to update the patch request. So updating a single task. Remember, when we update, we return the updated task back to the client. So I'm just going to expand patch, expand the try and catch here, and then if we scroll down to where we actually get the task back, which is here, within the while loop, just before you create the new task, we need to call that function. So we'll call this image array because we need to store the return of the function in an images array. So we'll call this function called, retrieve, what do we call it? Retrieve task images. And the database that we're using on this one, remember, an update will always call from the write DB, so we'll pass in the write DB on this one. So write DB, pass in the task ID and the returned user ID. And now obviously update our new task constructor, and we'll call this images or image array. So that's been updated, and obviously remember to also add the additional catch for the image exception. So image exception EX, and we're just going to copy and paste what's in the task exception because it's exactly the same code. So now that the patch is being sort of adjusted to take into account the task images, if we go to Postman and create a new request and patch this said task, so we need to go and copy our access token and add it in. And this, obviously the patch for the task, so update task, is a JSON body, and we're just going to update the title just to make it simple. So new title, I'm just going to write new task 1 title. And then if we send that, we obviously get the updated task back, but you can see that now we're also retrieving the new sort of updated task, but also a list of the task images associated with that task. So the client can obviously use that if it needs to. So if we go back to Atom, that is the, just scroll back up, that is the patch updated. So if we just minimize that down, we'll come back to delete because that's a little bit more complicated. We'll now do the update of the completed and incomplete. It's always a get request. For open the try statement, and just where the while loop is, we'll call this function. So, and it was image array, and then we'll want to retrieve task images for the said task. If we'll look up, we can see that it uses the read DB, so we'll pass that in this time. So read DB and then task ID, and then it is returned user ID. We'll update the task constructor call here, so we'll pass in image array, and obviously remember to add on your additional image exception catch statement, and we'll just copy the task exception. So now if we go back to Postman, and if we go to the get request, so instead of getting a single task, we'll get complete, I think it is. Obviously we've got no completed task because the 2 tasks I've got there are actually incomplete. So I'll change that to incomplete. And you can see we've got 2 tasks returned, but there seems to be a problem because our images array is blank. So we'll go and check Atom, and we'll just check to see what we're doing here. So this is the complete request is a get within our while function. Read DB, yeah. Task ID, yeah, that's wrong. Because we're not passing a task ID, obviously we're passing in /complete or incomplete. There is no task ID. So what we need to do is use the returned task ID from the database. So if we change that to row and then ID, that should now work. So you can see there that we're not actually passing in a query string with a task ID. We're actually getting the task ID from the returned row from the database. So if we go back to Postman, send that, you can now see that we're getting incomplete tasks. So task 1 there has some images, and then task 2 has no images, so that's correct. So that's working. So now if we go back to Atom, and if we minimize the complete and incomplete, we go to pages and do exactly the same in here. So within the get and the try, for this one we're using the readdb as well. So if we just scroll down to the while loop here, and if we add it in here, so we'll call this image array equals retrieve task images. First thing is the database connection, which is the readdb on this one, because that's up there. And the task ID, the same as the completed one. We're not actually passing in a task ID into the query string. We're passing in sort of a page and a page number. So we need to get the task ID from the database. So this is row ID and then returned user ID. Then we'll update our task here to add in our images array. Then we'll scroll down and make sure our catch is created. So catch image exception ex, and copy and paste the task exception because it's the same. So now if we go back to Postman and page/1, so you can see that we return in page 1 of tasks, and the task does include the images, so that's all okay. Okay, so that's that done. So the next one we need to do is, and I'm just scrolling up so I can close this down. The next one we need to do is get all tasks. So when we get all tasks, we will return any images with them said tasks. We won't worry about the post because obviously when we create a task, it won't have any images. So the way that we've built the model, it will always return an empty array anyway, so we don't need to touch that one. So if we open up get, scroll down, and within the while loop, if we just do image array equals retrieve task images, and the first thing that will pass in is the database connection, which is the readdb. Next is the task ID, but we're not passing in any query string to get a set task, so we'll return that from the database here. So row ID of 1 and returned user ID, and then obviously add it on here, image array, and then add on our catch block, image exception ex, and copy and paste the response. Now if we run Postman and just get all tasks, you can see that we're getting all tasks, and just the same as the last ones, you can see that we're getting the images as well. Okay, so that's all the get requests set up. We now need to work on the delete. So if we go back to Atom and minimize that, and if we open up our delete function here for a given task root, so task ID is 1 in this example, and open up try and catch here, and then we can see where we are. So we're deleting from tasks. Okay, so what we need to do is, I'll just talk you through what we're actually going to do. So when you send a delete task, we need to create a SQL query that will get a list of all images against that task. There may be none, there may be 20, but we need to get a list of all of them. Then what we need to do is to delete the row out of the database and then delete the actual image file. So we'll be using a transaction here because if deletion of the actual image file fails, then obviously we want to roll back any changes. We'll then basically follow the same logic here. So after all the images are deleted, we will then delete the tasks or the task from the database itself. And then once the task has been deleted, we can then delete the task folder within the task images folder here. So obviously we get a folder created for each task ID, but obviously if we're deleting the task, we need to do the cleanup of the folder itself. So what we'll do at the top of the try block, we'll create a new query. So we'll call this image select query. Oops, query. This will be the read database. So read DB, prepare, and we'll want to do the same SQL query here. Oops, that should be in quotes. So select TBL images.id, TBL images.title, TBL images.filename, TBL images.MIME-type, TBL images.task-id from TBL images and TBL tasks, where TBL task ID equals the passed in task ID. Oops, tasks ID equals passed in task ID, and TBL tasks.user ID equals the passed in user ID, and TBL images.task ID equals TBL tasks.id. So what this will do is return all of the images or image rows for the passed in task. So now what we need to do is bind these variables. So we'll bind, image select query, bind param. The first one is task ID, and we are getting the task ID in here, so we can just pass that in. So task ID, and then PDO param int image select query bind param user ID returned user ID PDO param int, and then are we only passing in two, task ID and user ID? Yeah, we're only passing in two, so image select query execute. And then obviously once we've got the list of images associated with that task, we need, so for each one of them, so we'll call this image row, and then it is image select query, and then it is fetch PDO fetch associative array. So now within this, for each of them rows that's been returned, we need to delete it. So that delete obviously includes deleting the row, but also deleting the physical file itself. So we need to begin a transaction. So we want to do this on the right DB, and we want to begin the transaction. So begin transaction, and because we begin the transaction there, we need to adjust our catch blocks to check to see if it's in a transaction, and then sort of roll it back if there's an error. So what we'll do is we'll update the catch blocks now. So catch PDO exception. What we need to do here is, just before we do this, so if write DB, and then it's in transact, not begin, it's actually in transaction. Then we need to write DB roll back. So that's that updated. So if we scroll back up, and so now we've begun the transaction. So for the image that's been returned, if we save this in a variable, so image is new image, and then it is image row ID, image row title, image row file name, image row MIME type image row, and then it's task ID. So that creates the image from the model. What we then need to do is to get the ID from that. So image ID, oops, and then that should be image get ID, because we're actually going to pass that into the delete query here now. So now we'll do another query equals, and this obviously we're deleting, so it's the right DB, and it is prepare. And we need to write the delete TBL images from TBL images and TBL tasks, where TBL images.id is equal to the passed in image ID. Remember, we're getting the image ID from here. Image ID, so ID, image ID we'll call that, and TBL images dot task ID is equal to the passed in task ID, and TBL tasks dot user ID equals to the passed in user ID, and TBL images dot task ID is equal to TBL tasks dot ID. So this should actually delete the said image row from the database. So once we do that, we need to bind. So query bind param, and the first one was image ID, and that is called image ID, and that is a PDO param integer query bind param, and it was task ID. So this is the task ID, not that one there, yeah. And this PDO param int, and the next one is query bind param user ID, and this is the returned user ID, PDO param int, and we need to now execute. So query execute, and so that should delete the row out of the table. So if that is successful, then we want to call image, remember the helper function that we made called delete image file. That should handle deleting the physical file. Obviously it will throw an image exception, and remember we need to add a catch for images because we're dealing with images here. So we'll do that now. So catch, and this will be image exception, and we will need to roll back. So we'll just copy this, paste it in there. We need to roll back, states to be 500, and the message will be the message from the exception itself. So we'll get message. Okay, so that's the catch done. Let's scroll back up. So if that's caught, that's fine, it will roll back. Otherwise, if it's successful, we need to commit, right, db commit. So that should save the changes to the database. Okay, so now that we've deleted every, because we're in a while loop, so that's now that we've deleted every image against the task, we can then go through the logic here. So delete, so this will delete the task itself. Scroll down, and this is where we check to see if the task has been found, and if it has, then we say task deleted. But what we need to do before we return this is actually delete the task ID folder itself, which would be 1 in this case. So we need to get the location to that, so we'll call task image folder, and we will put in, so the task controllers, obviously we're in controller here, so we need to navigate up the structure and navigate to task images. So we need to navigate up 3 times So one from here to there, one from there to there, and then one from htdocs to mamp, because remember our task images is in the mamp folder. Then we need to write task images, and then we need to suffix that with the task ID. So that gets that. Then what we should be able to do, check to make sure that the folder exists before we try and delete it. So we use a function called isDirectory. So does it exist? Task image folder. If it does exist, we use a function called rmdir. This is remove directory, so remove folder. And you pass in this location from the top here. So task image folder. So we'll pass that in. That should handle deleting the folder itself, and then we can send a 200 task deleted back. So we should be able to test this now. And what I'll do, I'll quickly open up the folder. You can see task images, and we've got task ID 1 in there. We will delete this task. Remember, it does contain images, so we'll just test this out now. Let's quickly go into the database and show you the images within the TBL images. We've got 2. All assigned against task 1. So if we go into Postman and we'll create a new delete, because we want to delete the task, and we want to delete task 1. We will have to, my session's probably expired now, so I am just going to get a new session access token, go back to the delete and authorization, and then pass in my token. And we should just be able to delete this now. So send, task's been deleted, we get a 200 status back, okay. We'll check the table, so we'll refresh this. It has deleted the task images, but has it deleted? Yeah, it's deleted the folder as well. So that's actually cleaned up the associated images for that said task. So now that the task doesn't exist, so we're going to tasks, you can see we've only got one task, which is task ID 2. So we'll quickly go back to Postman and just get tasks. I'll have to update my authorization token there. You can see that for us, we just have one task there now, which doesn't have any images. So that shows that we've actually cleaned up all the images associated with the task, and then obviously deleted the task itself. So that's now the end of this section for task images. Obviously we've dealt with images here, but a lot of the same principles still apply for all of the other different file types out there. You could upload Word documents to your task or whatever, whatever that you've created your API for. So I hope this has been helpful, and if you've got any questions, feel free to ask.